Max lay in the hospital bed, his frustration bubbling over as he lashed out at anyone who dared to come near him. He had always seen himself as more important than the others. An affluent businessman used to being obeyed, to having people cater to his every whim. When a young nurse named Emily entered cautiously to adjust his IV, he snapped at her with sharp disdain. "Can't you see I'm in pain? Did you even go to nursing school, or did you just put on a coat and call yourself a nurse?" Emily didn't respond. She simply looked at him with quiet sadness in her eyes and left the room without a word. A few hours later, Max's condition took a turn for the worse. He was struck by a severe attack, his body reacting unexpectedly to the medication. His face turned pale, his breath became shallow, and in a frantic panic, he grabbed at the tubes connected to him, screaming for help. And then from the shadows, there she was, Emily. She walked in with calm composure, a syringe in her hand. While everyone else hesitated, unsure of what to do, Emily swiftly administered the injection that no one else dared to try. Within moments, Max's condition stabilized. He looked at her, not from the pain but in horror. He realized, with chilling clarity, that she was the only one who truly knew how to save him, and he had just humiliated her. Max had been in and out of hospitals for most of his life. His wealth had afforded him the best treatment, the best doctors, the best of everything that money could buy. But today, as he lay in a private room of a highly exclusive clinic, it was clear that even all the wealth in the world couldn't protect him from the sharp, aching pain that coursed through his body. The accident had been severe, but not life-threatening. A car crash that left him with fractured ribs and a deep cut along his side. However, what had truly wounded him was the loss of control, the sensation of being helpless, and, most disturbingly, dependent on others. The last thing Max ever wanted was to rely on anyone. But here he was, at the mercy of nurses, doctors, and the sterile, impersonal world of hospitals. He was a businessman, and his entire identity had been built on confidence and dominance. He was accustomed to being in charge, to commanding rooms, to getting what he wanted when he wanted it. But now, lying in that sterile bed with tubes and needles protruding from his body, he felt as though everything he had worked for had collapsed. His wealth couldn't fix his pain, his power couldn't make him feel better, and most devastating of all, he couldn't make the hospital staff listen to his every demand. The staff here, unlike others he dealt with, weren't intimidated by his reputation. They did their jobs with professionalism, and that angered him. As he lay there, waiting for anyone else to come and tend to him, he grew increasingly frustrated. The pain was unbearable, and though he tried to maintain his composure, it was becoming harder and harder to suppress the irritability that was bubbling up inside him. He called out for a nurse, but the first one who entered, a young woman named Emily, did nothing to alleviate his frustration. Emily was young, no older than her mid-20s, with wide, gentle eyes and a soft voice. She entered the room, her steps measured and careful, her face set in the calm expression that many nurses had learned to adopt after years of dealing with irritable patients. She approached Max's bedside with the grace of someone who had been trained for this kind of work, moving to adjust the IV and check his vitals. Max looked at her, annoyance creeping across his face as he winced in pain. She was too young, too inexperienced in his eyes. She was nothing more than a kid in a uniform. She didn't know what it meant to be someone like him, to live in a world where everything was easy, everything was negotiable, everything was a transaction. She was just another person in a hospital who was supposed to help him get better. But from the way she moved, the way she avoided making eye contact with him, he could tell she was uncertain. She wasn't competent, and in that moment, he felt the need to remind her of it. His voice was sharp as he addressed her, demanding she do something, anything, to ease his discomfort. His words came out like daggers, aimed directly at her. He wasn't trying to be cruel. He simply didn't have the patience for incompetence. But as she glanced down at the IV and moved to adjust it, he became increasingly irritated. "Are you even qualified to be here?" he asked, his tone biting. "You're just standing there looking like a deer in headlights. What are you going to do? Tell me to breathe deeply and pretend that's going to fix anything?" Emily's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the IV line, but she didn't say anything. She had been trained to remain composed under pressure, even when faced with the unrelenting scorn of a wealthy, entitled patient. She had seen it all before, but something about the way he spoke to her, with such condescension, made her feel small. She had always been able to handle difficult patients, but this man, seemed to have a special way of making her question everything she knew about herself. Max could see the hesitation in her eyes, the subtle way she looked down at the floor, avoiding his gaze. It made him angrier. He was used to people fawning over him, offering their assistance with gratitude, eager to help him in any way they could. But here, in this sterile room, with his pain and humiliation mounting, there was no one to serve him, no one to make him feel powerful again. Instead, there was this young nurse, fumbling with his IV, pretending to care about his comfort. His frustration reached its peak. He needed someone competent, someone with experience, not a girl who was probably still learning the ropes. He demanded a different nurse, someone older, more seasoned. But Emily did not argue. She simply nodded, muttering an apology before turning to leave the room. Max lay back in his bed, the pain still coursing through him, his thoughts spiraling. He was accustomed to being in control, to making others bend to his will, yet here he was, lying in a bed with no control, at the mercy of a nurse who had clearly seen him as nothing more than another patient in the system. He seethed with indignation as he waited for a new nurse to arrive. His mind clouded with resentment and a growing sense of helplessness. His world had always been one of certainty, of demand and supply, but this felt different. It was a violation of the very essence of who he was. Hours passed and Max became restless. The pain was still unbearable, but he refused to show any weakness. He was a businessman, a man of influence and power. He could not afford to let anyone see him as vulnerable, not even for a second. But when the next wave of pain hit him, sharp and overwhelming, he could feel his composure begin to crack. Suddenly, the door to his room opened again. This time it was Emily. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge his presence in any particular way, but she held a syringe in her hand. She moved swiftly to his bedside and injected him with something before he could even react. Max froze, his body tensed, but as the medication began to work, he could feel the pain start to dull. He watched her work with a precision that left him stunned. In that moment, he realized that, despite his scorn, despite the way he had treated her earlier, she was the one person who seemed to know exactly what to do. Emily left the room as quietly as she had entered, leaving Max in a daze. His thoughts swirled, the realization dawning on him. She had known exactly what to do when no one else did. He had been rude, condescending, and cruel. He had belittled her in front of the entire staff, treating her like she was unimportant. But she was the one who had saved him. For the first time in his life, Max felt a rush of humiliation. He had underestimated her. He had believed that his wealth, his status, could protect him from the reality of his own vulnerability. But in that moment, lying in his hospital bed, he understood that no amount of money could change the fact that sometimes the person you least expect is the one who has the power to save you. And in that fleeting moment of clarity, as the medication began to soothe his pain, he realized that he owed Emily an apology, one he was not sure he was ready to give. The following day, Max's condition worsened. Despite the painkillers and the rest, the discomfort that had once been a dull throb now felt like an unrelenting fire searing through his ribs. He could feel his body rejecting the healing process, as if everything he had taken for granted, his wealth, his power, was useless in the face of this invisible enemy. His thoughts, clouded with frustration, turned inward. He had never been good at being passive, never accustomed to waiting for things to happen on their own. This feeling of helplessness gnawed at him, deeper than the physical pain ever could. Max's irritation flared again as the hours passed, each minute stretching on painfully. He could hear the faint murmur of voices in the hallway outside his room, but nothing seemed to make its way into the sterile confines of his space. The isolation of the hospital room felt more oppressive with each passing hour, and Max began to sink deeper into himself, wrapped in a cocoon of frustration and anger. The staff, despite their professionalism, seemed distant, almost mechanical in their efforts to care for him. He couldn't blame them. They didn't know what it was like to lose control, to lose the things that made him who he was. The pain was just a symptom of a much larger problem. As the day wore on, Max's agitation grew. His attempts to focus on anything, his phone, the television, the books on the table, proved fruitless. Every time he shifted in the bed, the pain surged, the familiar feeling of his body rebelling against him. The discomfort was more than just physical. It was a constant reminder that for once, he wasn't the one in control. The very notion gnawed at his pride, dragging his thoughts deeper into the dark corners of his mind. He wasn't accustomed to feeling so powerless. Then came the moment that Max had been dreading since the day he was admitted. A new nurse came in, carrying a tray with his food and a few medication doses. She entered quietly, but Max's sharp gaze immediately focused on her. She was different, no nonsense, efficient in her movements, yet there was something in her eyes, something guarded, as if she was prepared for a confrontation. He had noticed the way she avoided his gaze earlier. Her name was Emily, he recalled, and there was something about the way she looked at him that reminded him of a person who knew more than they let on. Max's heart began to race, not from the pain, but from the growing sense of dread that filled him. The whole situation felt off. He wasn't sure what it was, but something had shifted in the atmosphere of the room. His frustration flared up again, and the thought of being at the mercy of strangers, especially her, seemed unbearable. He had been demanding, cruel even the day before, but now it was different. The silence between them carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Emily moved quickly, setting the tray down on the small bedside table, her eyes scanning the monitors before she began adjusting the IV line. Max watched her closely, noting how professional she appeared, her movements smooth and practiced. But the distance in her demeanor unsettled him. There was no smile, no unnecessary words. She seemed focused, but the air between them was thick, charged with an unspoken tension that Max couldn't quite place. He could feel the eyes of the staff through the walls, the whispers, the judgments. He was supposed to be the one in control, but instead, he was completely dependent on this woman and the decisions she made about his care. The moment stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, as he lay there, unable to look away. His thoughts swirled as he tried to find a way to regain the power he had lost. It wasn't just about being in pain anymore. It was about feeling as though he had been reduced to nothing more than a patient, a weak, vulnerable man lying in a hospital bed, dependent on the mercy of someone who, in his mind, didn't deserve to be the one in charge. The thought of it stirred something deep inside him, a mix of shame and indignation. Emily finished adjusting the IV and turned her attention to the monitor, her focus entirely on the equipment. Max felt a flicker of anger at how she seemed to ignore him, to treat him like another patient among many. He was not used to being overlooked. He wasn't just a random person in this hospital. He was Max Reeve, a businessman, someone whose presence demanded respect. But Emily didn't seem to care. She moved about the room as if he were no different from anyone else. His frustration, previously contained, bubbled up once more. He wasn't sure what he wanted from her, an apology, an acknowledgement of his discomfort. Whatever it was, he couldn't hold it back anymore. He let out a sharp sigh, the sound cutting through the air. Emily glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable, before returning to her work. Max stared at the ceiling, his fists clenched at his sides. He could feel the edges of his composure starting to fray. The thoughts that had been slowly building in his mind finally exploded. He opened his mouth, but before he could say anything, the words caught in his throat. There was a sharp pain in his chest, a sudden agonizing jolt that made him gasp for air. He felt a pressure building in his throat, his heart racing uncontrollably. His vision blurred, the world around him seeming to collapse in on itself. Panic gripped him as he gasped for breath, clutching at the sheets, struggling to remain calm. The weight of the pain pressed on him from every direction, his thoughts spinning in a wild, uncontrollable spiral. In that moment, Emily's voice cut through the haze. Calm, controlled, but with a hint of urgency, she ordered him to lie back, to relax, to breathe. Max's vision swam as he struggled to focus on her, but there was no denying the precision of her actions. Without a hesitation, she moved swiftly across the room, retrieving the necessary tools. He could hear the sounds of her hands moving, the faint rustle of fabric as she prepared something he didn't fully understand. Max, despite the pain, felt a chill of realization sweep over him. This woman, this young, seemingly inexperienced nurse, was the only one who seemed to know exactly what to do. And in that moment, he understood something terrifying. Emily was the one who held the key to his survival. His chest tightened as he lay there, fully aware of the power dynamics at play. She had been the one to save him. Despite his rudeness, despite the way he had treated her, she had been the one to act swiftly, to take control of a situation that could have turned fatal. His thoughts circled back to the night before, when he had belittled her, dismissed her as nothing more than a helpless girl in a hospital gown. Now he was faced with the cruel truth. She was the only one who could save him, and it terrified him. As Emily worked, focused and efficient, Max couldn't help but watch her, the full weight of his own arrogance crashing down on him. He had been wrong about her, and worse yet, he had been wrong about himself. Max had spent the entire night awake, his mind racing with thoughts that were impossible to silence. The pain, though numbed slightly by medication, still gnawed at him, making every breath feel like an effort. His body, broken and battered from the accident, was a constant reminder of his helplessness. But it wasn't just the pain that kept him awake. It was the nagging realization that Emily, the nurse he had dismissed so callously, was the one who had saved him. The young woman he had so easily overlooked, the one he had treated as if she were beneath him, had been the one to pull him from the edge of danger. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, calm, composed, as she administered the injection that stabilized his condition. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he had understood. In the past, his world had been one of control and certainty. His wealth and influence had always shielded him from vulnerability. But in that moment, he had been stripped bare, completely dependent on the skills of a nurse who, just hours earlier, he had thought of as nothing more than a child in a uniform. Max had spent years building his empire, crafting a life where everything was meticulously planned and executed. He had surrounded himself with people who admired him, who deferred to him, who would never dream of challenging his authority. Yet here he was in a sterile hospital room, at the mercy of someone who had no reason to care about his wealth, his status, or his reputation. The realization gnawed at him, pulling him deeper into a spiral of self-reflection. The next morning, as the sun began to filter through the blinds, Max found himself lying in his bed, still overwhelmed by the events of the previous day. His body ached, but it wasn't the physical pain that occupied his thoughts. It was the growing sense of unease that lingered in his chest. He had to face the truth. Emily wasn't just any nurse. She had been the one who had recognized the danger, the one who had known exactly what to do when everyone else was paralyzed by uncertainty. She had saved him, and in doing so had exposed the cracks in his carefully constructed life. Max tried to push the thought aside, but it refused to be ignored. He could no longer deny the shift that had occurred. There was something about her that was different from the others. While the rest of the staff had treated him with respect, their treatment had always been perfunctory. Emily, however, had treated him like a person, not a patient. She had seen beyond the facade of his wealth, beyond the bravado that he wore like armor. She had simply seen him for who he was, a man in need of help. It wasn't just her competence that had shaken him. It was the way she had responded to him, the way she had managed to maintain her composure even when he had tried to tear her down. Max wasn't used to being confronted with his own weaknesses, especially not by someone like Emily. She had never once shown fear, never once faltered in her care for him, even when he had been rude, demanding, and condescending. Max knew deep down that he had been wrong. He had let his pride get in the way of seeing what was right in front of him. Emily was not just any nurse. She was someone who had the power to make a difference, someone who could save lives, and yet he had treated her like a servant. The weight of that realization hung heavy on him, gnawing at his conscience. As the day unfolded, Max found himself more and more preoccupied with thoughts of Emily. He couldn't shake the image of her steady hands, her calm demeanor as she had worked to stabilize him. There was something almost otherworldly about her presence, something that set her apart from everyone else in the hospital. Max's mind raced with questions. What had she seen in him that had made her act so swiftly? Did she understand the depth of his arrogance, the layers of entitlement that he had spent years building around himself? Or had she simply been doing her job, acting out of a sense of duty and professionalism? The more he thought about it, the more the questions piled up, creating a sense of unease in his chest. His sense of superiority had always been an anchor for him, something he could rely on to keep others at bay. But now as he lay in that bed, weak and vulnerable, he realized just how fragile that sense of control really was. Emily had exposed him for what he truly was, a man who, despite all his wealth and influence, was still subject to the whims of fate, still dependent on the mercy of others. It was a humbling thought, one that he wasn't ready to accept. Max wasn't used to being humbled. He had spent his life building an empire, constructing a persona of invincibility. But now, lying in that bed, he felt like a shell of the man he had once been. His reputation, his wealth, meant nothing in the face of his own vulnerability. And Emily had been the one to show him that. Max shifted uncomfortably in his bed, the reality of the situation settling over him like a weight. He had never been one to admit defeat, never one to apologize, but in this moment, he felt the sting of his own pride. He had to do something. He couldn't let this moment pass without acknowledging the truth. He had wronged her. He had dismissed her when she had done nothing to deserve it. She had been his lifeline, and he had treated her as if she were beneath him. The thought gnawed at him, pulling him into a deeper state of reflection. He needed to make things right. But how? How could he fix the damage he had done, especially now, when everything was so out of his control? The weight of his guilt settled heavily on his chest, suffocating him with each passing moment. As the day wore on, Max knew he had to confront the truth. He couldn't keep hiding from it. Emily had saved his life, and he owed her more than just an apology. He owed her his respect, his acknowledgement. But how could he possibly begin to make amends when he had so thoroughly shattered the foundation of their relationship with his arrogance? The question lingered in his mind as he lay back in his bed, staring up at the ceiling. The pain had dulled, but his thoughts were sharper than ever. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. His life, his sense of self, would never be the same again. The next few hours were a blur for Max. His body had started to recover, but the unease that had settled in his chest the day before remained. His mind couldn't stop racing, caught in an endless loop of self-reflection and guilt. The sense of control he had always relied on had been shattered, leaving him in a strange, uncomfortable state of vulnerability. He couldn't ignore the truth anymore. Emily was more than just a nurse. She was the person who had pulled him from the brink of death, and yet he had treated her with disdain, assuming she was nothing more than a novice. The weight of that truth pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. As he lay in his hospital bed, staring at the sterile white ceiling above him, Max couldn't help but replay the events of the previous day over and over in his mind. He had been so sure of himself, so certain that his wealth and influence made him untouchable. But Emily's quiet strength, her ability to remain calm and decisive in the face of his arrogance, had undone him. It wasn't just the way she had saved his life. It was the way she had treated him. She hadn't been intimidated by his anger or his words. She hadn't let his pride and entitlement influence her actions. In that moment, she had proven herself to be more than just a nurse. She had shown him what true strength looked like, and it terrified him. Max had spent his entire life building walls around himself, surrounding himself with people who wouldn't challenge him, people who wouldn't make him confront his own weaknesses. But Emily had cut through those walls with ease. She had seen through his bravado, through the layers of arrogance and control he had so carefully constructed. And now he was left to face the man he had become, the man who had belittled the one person who had the power to save him. As the hours dragged on, Max found himself becoming more and more agitated. His pride, the very thing that had defined him for so long, was eating away at him. He had to do something about it, but he didn't know what. The realization that he had treated Emily as less than she was, that he had dismissed her expertise and belittled her because of her age, filled him with a deep sense of shame. How could he have been so blind? How could he have been so cruel? Later that afternoon, the door to his room opened, and once again it was Emily. She entered quietly, her face calm and composed, her movements steady and assured. She didn't acknowledge him at first, as if nothing had changed between them. But Max could feel it. The distance between them was palpable. The air between them had shifted, and he knew that it was his fault. He had created this divide with his arrogance and his dismissive attitude. And now he had no idea how to bridge the gap. Emily moved around the room, checking his IV, adjusting the blankets, and doing everything with the same quiet efficiency that Max had come to expect from her. But this time, he couldn't ignore the way she moved. There was no hesitation in her actions, no sign of uncertainty. She was in control, and it reminded him of how much he had underestimated her. Max's heart pounded in his chest as he watched her. There was something about the way she moved, the way she carried herself, that made him feel both small and ashamed. He had always been the one who dictated the terms, the one who held the power in every situation. But in this room with Emily silently going about her work, he felt completely powerless. He could no longer hide behind his wealth or his status. The truth had been laid bare for him. He was just another patient, dependent on the skills of those around him. It was then that the truth hit him with the force of a tidal wave. Emily hadn't just saved him because she was a nurse. She had saved him because she had seen through his facade. She had recognized that beneath all the arrogance, all the wealth, all the power, there was a man who was just as vulnerable as anyone else. And she hadn't let that vulnerability define him. She had treated him with the same respect and care that she would give to anyone else, regardless of their status. She hadn't been intimidated by him, and that, more than anything, was what had made the difference. Max's mind reeled as he processed the weight of this realization. He had spent his entire life using his wealth and influence to control others, to bend the world to his will. But Emily had shown him that true power wasn't about dominance. It was about empathy, about recognizing the humanity in others and offering help without judgment. In that moment, Max realized how much he had missed. He had been so focused on building his empire, so consumed by the need to control every aspect of his life, that he had forgotten what it meant to truly connect with others. As Emily finished her work and moved toward the door, Max couldn't help but watch her. He wanted to say something, anything, to acknowledge the truth that had just been revealed to him, but the words stuck in his throat, suffocated by the weight of his own pride. He had been wrong. He had treated her with contempt, and now he was faced with the consequences. The gap between them had grown, and he wasn't sure how to close it. Max lay back in his bed, his mind spinning. The truth was undeniable. Emily had saved his life, not because of his wealth or his power, but because she had seen him for who he truly was. She had recognized that beneath the layers of arrogance and pride, there was a man who needed help, just like anyone else. And in doing so, she had shown him the most important lesson of all, that no matter how powerful we think we are all vulnerable in the end. The room was silent now, the only sound the faint hum of the monitors that tracked his vitals. Max closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He had spent so much of his life building walls, constructing barriers between himself and the rest of the world. But now, for the first time in a long time, he felt something else. Something he hadn't felt in years. A crack in his armor, a vulnerability he could no longer ignore. And as he lay there facing the reality of who he was, he couldn't help but wonder if it was too late to make things right with Emily. Could he repair the damage he had done, or had his arrogance permanently sealed the gap between them? The answer wasn't clear, but one thing was certain: he would never be the same again. The truth had been revealed, and it had changed everything. Max spent the next few days lost in a haze of guilt and self-loathing. The pain from his injuries had faded into the background, replaced by a more insidious feeling that gnawed at him from within. He could no longer deny the truth that had been revealed to him, the truth about how he had treated Emily. She had saved his life, and yet he had mocked her, belittled her, simply because he thought he was above her. His wealth, his power, his entire identity had been built on a foundation of control, but Emily had shown him just how fragile that foundation really was. As each day passed, Max's regret grew heavier. The sharp sting of his earlier actions replayed in his mind, each memory of his condescending words to Emily, a reminder of how far he had fallen. He had never considered himself a bad person. He had always seen himself as someone who worked hard, who had earned his success. But now the arrogance that had once been his shield felt like a burden, a weight that he couldn't escape. Max found himself staring at the ceiling for hours, consumed by his thoughts. He replayed the moments when he had dismissed Emily, when he needed to make things right. He knew that. But the question was how. How could he possibly repair the damage he had done? How could he apologize for something so much larger than just an outburst or an insult? The thought of facing Emily, of looking her in the eye after everything he had said and done, terrified him. But deep down, he knew he couldn't just leave things as they were. He had to make amends, even if it meant swallowing his pride and admitting that he had been wrong. Max's resolve began to solidify with each passing day. He couldn't undo the damage, but he could try to make things right. He had to start somewhere, even if it meant doing something he had never done before, apologizing. And not just any apology, but one that was sincere, one that acknowledged the depth of his actions and the hurt he had caused. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew that words alone wouldn't be enough, but he had to try. When Emily entered his room later that week, Max was ready. His heart raced in his chest, the weight of his apology pressing on him like a physical presence. He could feel the tension between them, the space that had grown since his outburst. She entered as she always did, quiet, composed, professional. But there was something different about the way she moved. The distance between them was palpable, and Max couldn't help but feel it. He knew it was his fault. He had built that distance with his arrogance and his cruelty. Max took a deep breath, the words he had rehearsed in his mind now ready to leave his lips. But as he looked at Emily, standing there before him, he realized that this wasn't going to be easy. He had to let go of his pride, let go of the walls he had built around himself, and allow himself to be vulnerable. It was a terrifying thought, but it was the only way forward. He started slowly, his voice thick with emotion. He could feel the weight of his words before they even left his mouth, and he knew that no matter what happened next, this was the first step toward healing. Not just for him, but for Emily as well. He had to show her that he saw her, that he recognized her worth, not just as a nurse, but as a person. Max could feel the weight of the silence hanging in the air, the tension in his chest as he waited for Emily's response. He didn't know if she would forgive him, if she would even want to hear him out. But he knew that he had to try. He had to acknowledge the hurt he had caused, and in doing so, perhaps begin to repair the relationship that had been broken by his own arrogance. Emily stood there, her expression unreadable. Max couldn't read her face, couldn't tell if she was angry, disappointed, or simply indifferent. But what he did know was that he had taken the first step toward making things right. He had admitted that he had been wrong, that he had treated her with disrespect, and that he regretted every moment of it. And that, he realized, was all he could do. The rest was up to her. Whether she accepted his apology or not, he had done what he could. Now it was in Emily's hands, and though he wasn't sure what would come next, he knew that he had at least faced the truth about himself. And in doing so, he had begun the long, difficult process of trying to make amends. The days that followed Max's apology were nothing short of transformative. He had taken the first step toward redemption, but now the real work began. The tension in the room remained, a reminder of the past, but Max couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. His pride, the very thing that had once driven him, was no longer at the forefront of his mind. The realization that he had been wrong, that he had treated Emily with disdain and arrogance, weighed heavily on him, but there was something else there now, something more profound. The understanding that in acknowledging his mistakes, in being vulnerable, he had allowed himself to grow in ways he never expected. Emily's reaction had been quiet. She had listened to his apology with the calmness she always possessed, but there was no immediate sign of forgiveness or animosity. She simply nodded, her expression unreadable, and continued to perform her duties with the same professionalism as before. Max had expected that. He knew that no matter how sincere his words were, it would take time to rebuild the trust he had shattered. He didn't expect forgiveness right away. What mattered now was his commitment to changing, to being better, not just for her, but for himself. The hospital room, once a place of frustration and resentment, had started to feel different. Max no longer saw it as a prison, as a place where his strength and power had been taken from him. Instead, it had become a space of reflection, a place where he could finally confront his weaknesses and understand what it meant to be truly vulnerable. Every day, as the hours passed, Max found himself looking inward, examining the man he had been and the man he wanted to become. The process was difficult, but it was necessary. As his physical condition improved, so too did his understanding of the world around him. He began to realize that his previous approach to life had been limited, that the world was much bigger than the small bubble he had created for himself. His wealth, his power, had always been tools for control, but they had never given him the ability to truly connect with others. He had spent years building a fortress around himself, believing that it would protect him from the vulnerability that comes with human interaction. But now he understood that true strength lay not in control, but in connection, in the ability to admit one's mistakes and seek to make amends. The days were long, and the process of self-reflection was not an easy one. Max was forced to confront the fact that he had neglected so many aspects of his life in his pursuit of success. He had isolated himself from people, from real relationships in favor of climbing higher on the ladder of success. He had placed so much importance on his career, on his image that he had failed to recognize the true value of human connection. Emily had been a stark reminder of that. Someone who, despite being just a nurse, had more integrity, compassion, and strength than he had ever recognized. One afternoon, as Max sat in his bed, staring out the window at the world beyond, he felt a sense of peace that had been absent in his life for years. He realized that he had been given a rare opportunity, not just to heal from his injuries, but to heal from the wounds he had inflicted on himself. The arrogance, the pride, the sense of superiority, all of it had been a mask, a way to protect himself from the fear of vulnerability. But now, as he sat in that room, he could see things clearly. He didn't need to hide anymore. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. What mattered now was authenticity, and he knew that he had to start living in a way that reflected that. Emily's presence, though still distant, had become a source of quiet inspiration for Max. He watched her work with a newfound respect, her hands steady as she moved about the room, caring for patients with a grace and kindness that he had never truly understood before. She was a constant reminder of the humility he had so long ago abandoned. In her, Max saw everything that he had been missing in his own life: compassion, patience, strength, and a willingness to help others without expecting anything in return. She had been the one to save him, not just from his physical pain, but from the emotional prison he had locked himself in. As Max's recovery continued, he found himself slowly but surely changing. He began to seek out more meaningful conversations with the people around him. He started to take a genuine interest in the lives of those who worked with him, listening to their stories, learning from their experiences. For the first time in his life, he was truly present, not just physically, but emotionally. He had stopped viewing people as tools to be used in his climb to the top. Instead, he saw them as individuals with their own struggles, their own stories, their own worth. The day came when Max was finally discharged from the hospital. He had healed, both physically and emotionally, in ways he had never anticipated. As he walked out of the hospital doors, he couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the experience, for the lessons he had learned, for the person he had become. Emily had been the catalyst for this change, and though he didn't know if she would ever truly forgive him for the way he had treated her, he knew that he owed her everything. Max had learned the hard way that true power didn't come from wealth or status. It came from vulnerability, from the willingness to admit when you were wrong, and from the courage to change. He had spent his life chasing success, but now he understood that success wasn't about achievements or accolades. It was about growth, about learning to be a better person every day. And in that moment, as he walked away from the hospital, Max felt a sense of peace knowing that his journey was just beginning. He had been given a second chance, not just at life, but at living with meaning. And for the first time in a long time, he was ready to embrace it. The lesson had been hard, but it had been worth it. And as Max stepped into the world beyond the hospital, he carried with him a new sense of purpose. A purpose that was rooted not in power or control, but in kindness, in humility, and in the desire to make a difference in the lives of others.